Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome. I am Rhonda Boyle, your SOAR online community leader, and we are here to bring you calls that inform and empower you to move forward in your life through strengths-based development. And today we are here to talk about nonprofit organizations and some of their unique challenges. I have an expert panel with me today to discuss these issues and ways to maximize your people and your processes. So I really want to kind of divide this into two sort of separate categories or two different conversations because I think they are different. I think this is one of the things that makes nonprofits unique, and that is you have the volunteer side, and then you have the challenges around the where you want to go and your objectives for the year. So how about if we start off like that? And I want to open it up. First of all, let's talk about volunteers, because I think that that is an issue that's always upper mind for a nonprofit. And Carol Johnson, you have worked for quite some time. I'm going to unmute you quick and have you come in. Let me introduce you, first of all, to Carol. She is the founder of Connected Team Consulting. She's been 9 years, has 9 years as an executive director, and she now leverages her experience working with nonprofit staff and executive leadership. So let's talk about this volunteer issue. It's sometimes a revolving door.
It is sometimes a revolving door, and often the first place I like to start with volunteers is talking about your board, because you're continually bringing in new board members, and if you have term limits, then you're needing to do that. And you bring in people maybe that you don't know real well, and you need to find out quickly what their strengths are so that you can utilize them. Mm-hmm. Because there's nothing worse than a board member that you can't utilize.
So now really I've tried to separate the two, but they can't be separated, can they? Amy Allen, board members and volunteers in the organization are volunteers. I'm going to unmute you and share a little bit more about that. Can you hear me, Amy?
Oh, yes. Yes, your board members are your volunteers. I mean, you can have volunteers in many capacities, but board members are giving you their time, their talent, their treasures as volunteers.
Mm-hmm. And so it really is, so we can't really divide those. So I think that the issue, because there's what causes, let me just go back and say, what causes that rotation in and out? Why is that there? Leanne, tune in and fill us in.
Yeah, I mean, the rotation is a couple-fold. Carol referenced that, you know, when you have boards, you have term limits. So you do want that fresh blood. You do want those folks in there, and it's in their bylaws. So there is a natural progression that you can anticipate. There's also those that you can't anticipate. Either a board member moves on or something happens. And so, you know, finding those solutions when you do have those backfills or a need arises in an organization. Oftentimes, if you have a strong staff and you have a marketing firm or a marketing department and some great people in that element, but then you lose that person, you lean on your board and those expertise in board development and in PR or in law, you know, when you're entering contracts. So the board is really critical to understand and have a clean lens on what they can contribute. So even as a board member, you have a responsibility to come and say, this is what I'm good at and this is what I want to do, because it's a challenge for both pieces. So there's natural progressions, things you can anticipate, and in life there's things you can't.
Well, and so Carol, let me go back to you. Leanne, thanks for your input, and I'll share where we can find you in a minute. But Carol, let's go to that board situation, because it does, there does seem to be sort of an instability there, because why? People lose energy, or they put in the wrong place initially? What's causing that?
It can be that, and as Leanne said, it can also be life. I have had board members that came and needed were really willing to work, and then their lives fell apart. And you give them a year, and then you plug them in where they're best.
Yeah. So it is something that I think executive directors have to be like on top of constantly, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
So, John, let's shoot out to John. Let me just introduce you to him. He is the founder of North Star Coaching, and you have 25 years experience in the nonprofit sector too. And so what are some of the ways that we can solve this issue for an executive director?
As far as board turnover?
Yes, board turnover, and then leveraging the talent that you have, and really, how do we get them in the right seat on the bus? Because don't you think that they would stay longer if they were in the right place?
Yeah, I think strengths come in a big way with, first and foremost, them understanding the rest of the board and how to work with them and how to leverage them. Really goes to the understanding of the executive director and their strengths. So really honest, deep conversations about how they will work together to find success. In theory, the board directors maybe been around the organization for a while, and they have things they want to see happen in the organization. And the executive director is the way, the one who's leading the day-to-day operations to carry that out. So to me, it's first and foremost a conversation about how can the executive director be supported by the board. And to me, that conversation is not just up front, that's ongoing. If that conversation is active to me, it's a much greater likelihood that, one, the relationship's going well, the organization is thriving, and the board chair is actually enjoying what they're doing there because they see their purpose being fulfilled in that role.
Yes, and I really love what you said about it having to be constantly at top of mind awareness, because if it's not, this is where the holes, people just shift and fall out without you maybe even knowing where they went.
Yeah, and another piece in there, I mean, I don't know if it was mentioned yet or alluded to, is that sometimes board chairs, maybe it's their first time as a chair, maybe it's not. They don't always know what it means to be a board chair. I mean, it's more in the consulting realm of what that means, but sometimes they haven't been in that kind of leadership role, even though they've been successful in many other ways in their lives. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's them figuring out in some way what they need to really be an effective leader in that role.
Right. Yeah. So you have found, well, let me run over here to Leanne, because I know that she has worked a lot. And by the way, I don't know that I introduced you, so I will do so now. Leanne owns and operates Telos Coaching and Consulting. And she's also the assistant director of Link, a nonprofit organization that helps people with independent living. So Leanne, let's bounce off of what John said. Sometimes do they have that top of mind of awareness? How do they create that for themselves?
Now, in terms of how do the volunteers create that top of mind awareness?
No, really more of the executive director creating that. Like John said, it has to be constantly top of mind awareness. And I guess that would be some type of plan to me. Planning, maybe having board planning or something. I don't know. I'm asking how we can solve this.
Yeah, I think as John alluded to having those ongoing conversations. So as an executive director and as someone who leans on the board for expertise and advice and counsel, understanding they have limited time as well. These are volunteers in a true volunteer capacity. So leveraging what they're going into those conversations with, here's what we need, here's what you bring, here's what I bring. And those honest, transparent conversations as a group of individuals that care about the mission and the work that the nonprofit is doing, it helps to be mindful of people's time. So when we're meeting once a quarter, or some nonprofits meet once a month, but even some meet as limited as once a quarter, to be able to be as efficient and effective as that time helps those board members be engaged. There's a number of tools out there that are not just skill aligned, but also you can have those conversations with them about their strengths and how they manage them. in the team capacity, but as well as how the ED and the executive director comes at projects, strategic planning, annual planning, all of those things. But when you pause and have those conversations, it can really help productivity. It's not even pausing, it's just with a conscious mindset coming in with that approach. People are there to do a good job. So
they are. And I really love what you say about the limited time, because they are limited in their time as a volunteer. And what they want to do is contribute in ways that give them energy and not things that drain them. So how are you going to figure that out? Let's run over to Alan Barclay. Alan, let me introduce you real quick. You have been around really training and management. You have a lot of training and management experience and developer, but you're also a volunteer for a service industry. So help us understand how someone can make it better for a volunteer.
Well, I think it just helps to know that the organization is willing to develop them and create some time for them. And there's a lot of places for people to volunteer, and for an organization to, really contribute and spend some time developing you as a volunteer, I think helps to keep you as their volunteer. And I'm really lucky today. Like you mentioned, I work with Freedom Service Dogs, and I'm actually fostering a service dog. And so if you hear some groaning in the background, it isn't me. It's the dog. His owner had to have some surgery, so I stepped in to foster his dog while he's having some surgery. So he's having a little adjustment, so he's groaning a little bit in the background.
Well, that nonprofit is clearly tapped into you, where you would just say, yes, pick me.
Yes.
So, you mentioned something I think that's very important that is often overlooked. And John, I'm going to invite you to come in and talk about that for just a second. And that is investing in that personal development piece, so that you're all working together to make sure that you're leveraging and maximizing what you do have, the resources and the people resources. But that's not always easy, right? There seems to be a reluctance there to spend money on any kind of personal development. You're going to have to unmute. There you go.
Thanks, Rhonda. Yeah, limited budgets, limited time. But a lot of times a sense that it's more virtuous to pour any money available into the programs or whatever services and whatever the nonprofit is making happen in the world. And that development, personal development of any kind, is sort of seen as fluff. When, if you look on the corporate side, all of those, all the major organizations out there have coaches, and they're doing leadership development because they know how far that gets them. And I would say here, this image of, or this saying of, put the oxygen mask on yourself first. It seems like in nonprofits, it's the reverse, and it seems virtuous. No, I'm gonna help the program succeed by not spending money on myself or my staff to develop them, and which includes volunteers. And that could just be looked at as time or energy, but money is definitely in there. And my sense is the same results, the same return on investment come in non-for-profits, and maybe even more so than they do on the for-profit side. So I think it's a mindset first and foremost.
Yeah, I would definitely think more so, because what a nonprofit organization or a foundation has is discretionary hours. Like, they're not getting my 8 to 5, they're getting whatever I've got left over. And so how do I know that I'm doing and able to maintain my volunteer service if I don't know exactly where I fit based on what gives me energy?
Right. And also just a sense that if the director, let's just say executive director, is not investing in themselves, they may also not be investing in others. So again, just a mindset that if everything is about how to win the grant and how to start a new program and how to do that, then, I've read that a lot of executive directors, I think most of them are done in under 5 years. And they burn out, or some other word for it. What an organization loses in that time is just crucial. Turnover of executive directors, not to mention board members. And to me, a lot of it has to do with engagement, investment, figuring out their strengths and working on them as they go along to really continue a huge positive impact at the organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's talk to Amy Allen. Amy, can you come and share your experience? Because you work really with mostly just executive directors. Are they having, is that what your experience has been also? Let me just share everyone that boards are your specialty. You've been working with them for over 25 years. So tap into or bounce off what John just said.
John, I like what John said. It really is virtuous in many ways to not spend money and to run a very lean organization, and that doesn't always serve the organization. But, the board and the executive director have an interesting relationship because the board hires the executive director, but the executive director is the one that leads and inspires and trains and has their board work with them on achieving their goals. I think building on the strengths from what I've seen, I really like working with boards and helping them see what they have collectively as a board, where their strengths are, and then also individually. So when it does come time to looking at their strategic plan and their mission and their vision, they can really hone in on where they can serve the organization best and feel good about it.
So have you seen less of that burnout then as a result of that? Has that been your experience in the work that you've done?
I think it depends on the board, Rhonda. If as a executive director, if you're coming in and they didn't have term limits and maybe the board members have been there a long time, then there'll be turnover. There will be turnover. But as the executive director, you can help shape what the board looks like moving forward. So the boards that I've worked with have been very passionate about their organizations, and there hasn't been a lot of churn on the board. They really do stick there. Board members want to know what they can do specifically to move the organization forward. And they all bring their gifts, and I think by utilizing those gifts, you're going to keep them for their whole term.
Mm-hmm. Great. Carol, I hear you. Hang on. let me unmute you. Go ahead.
One of the most important times to look at the strengths of the board is when you have changes in board leadership, because different board presidents have different strengths. And so the executive director has to change how they're relating to their group of officers based on the strengths that the board members have. One president may be your mouthpiece and love to be out talking, but the next one might be more reserved. And so you need to find another mouthpiece or find another way for that board member to get the message out.
Mm-hmm. And that's just another juggle piece that somebody who's working in nonprofit leadership has to manage, right? And so it makes it easier if they have someone to come along beside them and help them and have something, right? And that's been your experience too. So let's talk about, because, John mentions money. And so I want to talk about money. Leanne, let's have you come back in, because doesn't it seem that most nonprofits, all they're doing is fundraising?
Absolutely. I think most nonprofits, we do a lot of chasing the money. It's just by design. The challenge that comes with that too is sometimes nonprofits will get so worried about chasing the money, they'll have mission drift, or they'll have something that really challenges them and their foundation to a core. And that can come from any, that could come from a board lead in terms of some funding and those pieces. The other piece that I think happens is we see a style of fundraising, we see a style of fund development out there that works for one person, and then we can see executive directors try to mimic that. That maybe not be their style, or may not be how they actually go about raising funds. And I have a great story of that. We had two development directors that had two very different strength set. One had competition, communication, achiever, woo, and harmony. The other had consistency, harmony, responsibility, intellection, empathy, and relator. And how they approached dollars, they both ended up at the end of the year coming in with the same amount of funds because they went about it very differently. But if you had a board or you had an executive director that said, this is how we raise money, then one would have been successful if it was you go out and you have these big events with large people. The other would not have been successful if she had not been able to work it where she was connecting one-on-one with people and saying, if you don't, if this doesn't work for you, who do you know? Or you're really invested, who else can I talk to? And they both had very different approaches. So when it comes to money, that can be a challenge because it does sometimes seem desperation, but there's definitely different styles out there, and strengths can help you unleash the style that works for your team or who you have.
It has to be fluid, doesn't it? Amy Allen is the fundraising queen. I'm going to bring her in again because you have that. This is your area of expertise with nonprofits, is raising money. So has this been helpful, really being able to coach teams in how they raise money based on how they're wired?
Oh, absolutely. I think what I see with boards is that they come in and they say, oh, I don't want to ask. They're afraid of that part. And that's just such a small part of fundraising, building the relationship at people in all different ways. Yes. And especially, every board member has a different strength and they are not going to approach it the same way. I wholeheartedly agree with Leanne. I think you really do have to be fluid as the executive director to know how to bring out the best in each of your board members.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of this can be handled through that strategic planning, John. Isn't that a really big way that you coaches and consultants who work in this area can help these executive directors strategize and make these plans?
Absolutely. And I think a huge part of that is there's a couple of things that come to mind. One is when you're engaging in that plan, and we're talking about strengths as well, that the size of an organization, and maybe there's a conscious choice there of serving locally and wanting to stay smaller, or being larger, serving a larger geographical area, and then life cycle of where they are. Are they a startup? Or have they been around for 5 years? Have they been around for 30 years? That all of those things, strengths-wise, are going to come into who you really need, what strengths you need, and then what kind of plan you could carry out. Because if the plan is going to be something that takes place over 3 to 5 years, there's going to be transition during that time. So some of this is really trying to figure out, what does the organization hold strength-wise? And some of it of who the players in the moment, what do they hold? But it's trying to figure out, based on the plan, what is needed to really carry that forward, potentially beyond anybody who's in the room working on the plan.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's that planning that opens up a lot of doors for these organizations to get more efficient, Leanne, right? That's all part of it. That planning piece is, again, we're going back to leveraging and maximizing what we have. What's been your experience in that?
Yeah, and I think, John, I love what John said when he mentioned sometimes seeing who's not in the room, right? Because sometimes we will have a group of very committed volunteers, but we're still missing something that needs to move the mission forward, or needs to move the strategic goals forward, or the vision of where you want the organization to go. And, at some point in time, sometimes nonprofits can just get so tunneled with who's in the room, and they create a plan around that piece and that visionary. Where are we missing? Where are those holes? What do we need to move us forward? It's not necessarily who's in the room to get us where we need to go. It's who do we need around the table? And that strengths conversation can really help propel that element going forward. So you can say, we're missing this and we need to maximize our what we have, and we need to recruit where we need to go. And then who's going to recruit? Who's going to be out there to get it? And how are we going to do this?
Well, that sounds so much more intentional in recruiting than just trying to find warm bodies and people that are breathing. I mean, Alan, let's go over here real quick, right? You are taking care of that puppy you've got in the background because you are tied into that mission.
Right. Well, I've been sitting here thinking, I forgot about an experience that I had as a fundraiser for United Cerebral Palsy many years ago. And I think of how dependent I was on the board to help me with these fundraising events. And had I had known what those board strengths were, I would have really been able to know who to ask for on certain parts of those events, especially the hard part of asking for sponsorships. And geez, that would have just saved, would have made the role of a fundraiser so much easier. But ask me the question again. I got sidetracked. Sorry.
I was just bouncing off of what Leanne had said about your being totally, tied into the mission.
Oh,
Your
absolutely. And I find that so much with the employees, transitioning a little bit to the staff. The staff with nonprofits, they typically do tend to choose those nonprofits that they have a passion for. And so that there is so much passion in what they're doing, and then they also feel that obligation to the people who donate to the organization and where their funds are coming from, and just to be able to provide again that training and helping those employees become more engaged in their organization by knowing their strengths, just as it does with corporations, is so powerful. But the burnout can be really high on your employees in nonprofits, but their passion is there, but they can still get burned out. But by really getting into their strengths and their teams and helping them know the strengths of the people that they work with just helps with the engagement and helps to continue that excitement that they have over their desire to support this organization.
Mm-hmm. And you know what? We go back to talking about making sure that the people get put into the right place. Oftentimes, am I right, Carol? A nonprofit they can have or a leader can have a sense of desperation when they lose the volunteer, that they got to replace that, and it's oftentimes they will put one of these amazing people who's here to volunteer, they'll put them in the wrong place, and then they lose energy.
Exactly.
Yeah. You actually have an experience about that with someone you worked with. Share that story with us.
Sure. We had a woman who'd worked in banking, and so she was always put into the treasurer role. And it turned out that what she really wanted to do was get out and ask for money. And so she was willing
to those rare people who liked to ask for money.
I know, isn't it amazing? So we tested her strengths, and we determined that, and we switched her over, and they found another person to do the treasurer role. I think there's also there's a tool where we've talked a lot of, everyone has mentioned money and boards and raising money. There's a new tool called the Builder Profile 10 that measures how you grow an organization. And it works really well with boards in terms of money, because it tells you whether the person is a mouthpiece, if they're out and they're a rainmaker. It tells you whether they're a conductor, or it tells you whether they're a knowledge expert. And so you can divide your board into all those roles, and then they can work together. And the conductors can pull together the fundraising events, and the rainmakers will be the mouthpieces. They'll go and speak at anybody's house party, and the experts know who to invite. And it just helps the board to work together so that they don't feel so alone.
And I'm sure that every nonprofit organization or foundation out there would love to have somebody who's going out as their mouthpiece asking for money. Right. John, share with us about how you have seen, what have you seen with, because you've worked with, for 25 years, you've been doing this, working with nonprofits, right? And so what kind of impact have you seen by organizations that start this process and that start to do that personal development and work with their teams and their people?
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost is a reality check for, especially for people transitioning newly into like an executive director role, something like that, that I don't know if there's a true preparation to become an executive director. I don't know if there's a true preparation of any kind of serious leadership role that you're excited about, because it's the commitment and what's possible. So you're going to have to learn in that space, right? And hopefully that's a joyful process, right? Not something you just have to trudge through. So I'd say what I've seen is people coming into a role, being overwhelmed. Boom, something is happening. And hopefully they recognize either I'm not good at this, or I'm not even being asked of how I can be supported. Because right, there's what they're good at, and then they have to find somebody else who's good at the other things, hopefully. And so what I've seen is, I think, again, it's just coming back, it seems so simple, but an opening up of conversations, both with board members, the board chair, but also just people on their staff, just as a general leadership approach to really get at what do people think they're good at? Do they understand what roles that they're playing and what they're trying to accomplish? The kinds of things that you would approach when you were onboarding someone, when someone was just coming onto a team. Those same questions, I mean, to me, seem to need to be there ongoing, regularly, with everyone in the organization. And this includes volunteers. And what I've seen sometimes is a recognition that maybe the role they came into, there's a different need now. So I think Carol was maybe speaking, I can't remember who was speaking to this now, but so you hire an executive director and they've come into a startup and they have startup energy. They love that chaos. They love the moving and grooving and everything happening all at once, right? And 3-4 years down the line, the organization is now becoming more stable. It's much clearer. That person's strengths, what's going to satisfy them, what they can really make happen, might not be the right match. So maybe they would choose to learn and grow with support, and maybe they hire in somebody else. But it could be that that's the logical point for both parties to move on, right? And find someone new who's a better match for that time. So I think, to me, what I've seen and I really like is an appreciation of what's needed for the organization, for the role, and just an honest conversation about it, because they're always changing. And definitely we talked about transitions. When there's a transition and you have an intact board, and maybe you've had a director who's been there for 10 years, 20 years, and now they're bringing in a new director. It doesn't matter who that person is. They are completely different than the last person who was there. And maybe the board wants different, but different is going to feel and look and act so different in the day-to-day experiences. So everyone's got to be ready to have a lot of conversations at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see that. And again, you're going back to that total top of mind awareness and keeping it absolutely, keeping the conversation alive all the time. Leanne, I want to go back to you for a second on, because you've really had a lot of success in transitioning people into this type of a different kind of environment where they really start to analyze and look at people as they're gifted and placing them. Can you share with us an experience that you had that you just really know that was the power behind that impact?
Yeah. I think my favorite story, Rhonda, I'm really glad you asked this, is one that backs up just a little bit to finding a volunteer who was engaged in an organization that you don't necessarily put in that box of being a board member. When we talk about board members, we think business leaders in the community. We think, there's a number of things that kind of go into that picture. And we had a gentleman that was working with Special Olympics, that was a Special Olympics athlete who wasn't able to read or write, but once that skill and that strength mindset came into the mind for the organization, this gentleman had an incredible he had context as his number 5, and he was very, very good at like watching what was happening and being able to articulate. And what he needed was someone alongside him to help lift up those other things that he wasn't good at, that we just assume were, you know, the reading, the writing, those pieces. But he was able to articulate what was needed through communication themes, through all of those elements. And at some point in time in an organization, when you become a strength mindset organization, you start to uncover all these people's gifts. And then he came up through the youth advisory committee and as an adult and working with a number of organizations. And one of the largest donors was his employer, because he was really good at wooing people and winning people over and getting people out there. And he became a valued point of the board. And sometimes when we look at what we're doing as an organization through a strength lens and through people are coming up, not just what we assume we need, we uncover this diversity within our volunteers at all levels of the organization and our community members at all levels of the organization. And then our board is so much more enriched, and our mission and the work that we're doing may actually be elevated because we've uncovered these amazing gifts in people. And I think that's one of my favorite stories, because he's able to really contribute not only the mission, but in a meaningful way. He shows up and he's able to remind all of these people who get lost in their day-to-day operations of, oh no, we said we were going to do this as a board. Let's be held accountable to that. And that's pretty powerful on any board, regardless of what that is. And he just needed a little element of support. So that's probably one of my stories. Once you become a strength-minded organization, you uncover a lot of greatness internally.
Yeah, it's like a scavenger hunt, and you're out on the hunt to find the hidden secrets that people have. That, guess what, Leanne, isn't this been your experience? They want to contribute. They want to give those things.
Absolutely. And we know as coaches, but I think what people start to uncover when you find that people are showing up with positive intent, they're showing up because they want to contribute. Sometimes that can get, they want to, like, if they want to get started, they're those people that get the fire going and get things maximized. That can be perceived as impatient, or the person isn't really waiting for the plan to get into its big vision. When you understand that, I'm just talking to myself, but I've heard other people say about me. But it's one of those things that when you come at it with the strength lens, you're able to say, okay, this is what my board needs. This is what my volunteers need. Here's what we have. And those people are coming to contribute in meaningful ways. You're just able to really harness it and unleash it if you have that strength lens approach to it.
Yeah, it's looking for what's right with people instead of being frustrated by what they're not able to do. You know, so it puts a completely different view. It's a different vision, and it makes people feel differently, doesn't it?
Yeah, and when you're looking for engagement, I mean, we talk about it with employees a lot, but when you're looking at it in a volunteer aspect, people are busy. They're not going to show up unless they feel empowered, unless they feel appreciated. And when you're able to unlock how people feel appreciated by giving them an agenda ahead of time, you know, some of these simple things that just get lost, or celebrate, they don't want to be the treasurer anymore, as Carol talked about. They want to go ask for money. Man, that's gold. I mean, I hear that, and I'm going to go talk to all the treasurers on the nonprofits that I work with. Do you want to ask for money? You know, we just sometimes don't ask the questions. So we not only have to ask the questions, we have to listen to the answers.
Yeah, for sure. So talking about that engagement piece real quick, John, I want to ask you to weigh in on what you've seen or your experience of increased engagement as some of these, bringing some of these new changes or approaching it, I guess, in this way. What have you seen?
Let's see. I would say, thinking of a story, I would say one example that's very recent is someone I'm working with who's an executive director, new to the executive director role at an organization, again, where there's a transition of someone who's been there 20 years. And what I've seen is the board wanted someone who was great at vision, setting a new vision, someone who was really good at improvising, someone who was really good at communication and, exciting people. And what I've seen is they continue to come up against conversations with the existing staff and volunteers, which include the board, who are still seeing the old executive director, are still, even though they know this is a different person, the culture of the organization is set, or it feels very set. And so what I've seen, I'm gonna try to encapsulate this, but I've seen questions at a very deep level about what do we want the culture of the organization to be to really maximize our mission and vision. And so that could look like someone changing roles. And I don't mean leaving the organization necessarily, but really a review of this person who's been doing this role for 10 years, but they really have a passion for this, or they're really good at this. Mm-hmm. Why don't we, but there hasn't been a role for that. Sometimes it's really looking at who are the people right in front of you. Again, coming back to strengths, and being willing to say, shift the culture of the organization to be one that is open to these kind of changes in the name of serving this greater good. So specific example would be someone I just worked with who had a fundraising director and who changed roles after 20 years and became more on the program side, not because they were ineffective at fundraising, but they found that their ability to do operations was something that even excited them more. And that was something they were really able to help the organization with. So, after 20 years, who would think, right? If you have someone who's being effective at their role, why are you going to ask them, what do you want to do? But I'm saying that question is always the one at the forefront for me. So it's continuing to check in of what is really exciting for them, what's not, and how does that match with the organization? Because we spend most of our lives at work, right? We want that to work for us as well as the organization.
John, let me just ask you real quick. Is there anything that, I want to go back just quick to the conversation we had earlier about this sense of not wanting to invest in personal development and the employees as opposed to the mission, not realizing that they're tied. How do you share that information with executive directors and other nonprofit leaders so that that door can be opened?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think they're normally coming to me with some symptoms, right? So something like turnover is so high. We just finished training the last person and now they're leaving. Or we had that person who was so effective and they're leaving. And so turnover is usually a big indicator, but it also could be, the worst, some people have said, if you don't have turnover, but people are just not engaged, right? So they're staying because they love the organization, but they're not really engaged. They're sort of checked out. So sometimes that sounds like a director may be saying, I don't really feel like I have the trust. I don't feel like I have I don't have the motivation of the staff. And when we start digging into it a little more, it's the reality that it's not really known what the strengths of their staff are. It's not really known. And then once you start, it's like an onion, right? You start peeling it away and you recognize, I don't really know who these people are. I don't really know what they're good at and what engages them. And generally a few well-placed questions, as coaches, along the lines of, how do you know what they're interested in? How do you know what really makes them tick? And generally there's conversations that haven't happened, or they've happened, but they've happened on we don't want to lose the fundraising person, so I can't ask them too many deep questions about whether or not they're enjoying their job because we would be doomed if they left.
Right.
right? Which I get it. And there's a cost to not asking questions, both the individuals and the organization. So I think it starts with someone noticing some symptoms of something not quite right. From there, a lot of times it will lead to some sense of not really knowing what the strengths are and what's needed with an individual or with an organization in some ways. And definitely board ED role definitely comes in their lives as well.
Okay, great. So Carol, just to affirm that, has that been your experience, that it always has to start with a challenge, pretty much? Okay, I'm not hearing you. Hang on, there you go. I think maybe, nope. Let me get you to unmute yourself.
There we go.
There you go.
Yes, and I like what John said about asking people what they like and and doing it as a group. Because if you've got your team together and you find out that one person has high activator and just loves to get things started, and another has deliberation and sees risk everywhere, they will tend to think that each other are trying to shut them down.
You're talking about my marriage here.
And if you can get them to acknowledge that that's how they're wired and that they're not doing it out of any sense of malice, you've immediately smoothed out potential misunderstandings, which is just golden in teamwork.
Well, and you have to do it. I mean, it's really important for them to stay together. I mean, I'm not kidding when I say my husband and I are completely opposite. So, and that's what you find oftentimes in boards. They come together and they're like completely different because they're all bringing different gifts to the table. And if they don't understand that they're different, then that causes some of those communication issues and other problems. Exactly. Alan, you have worked with, as we said earlier, a lot of different organizations and with nonprofits too. And doesn't it always begin with a challenge? You just have to, that's where really coaching and all of these strategies always start with a problem.
Definitely. And thinking about with one of the organizations I'd worked with, the different departments were too siloed. And the comment continually happens is, there's just too much work, not enough time. I'm always putting out fires. And by doing the team buildings and being able to have other teams appreciate the strengths of each other, when one department was really struggling, they could see how they could go use someone from another team to help them with their issues. And it helped to build so much more camaraderie amongst the organization. And so they didn't feel like they all had to be doing everything, but they realized they could ask for help from other team members who had those strengths. And it's always a time constraint. There's always too much to do, but being able to utilize the strengths of other people really helps with the engagement, helps with the camaraderie. And that's just vital to any organization.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like you're not really talking just about nonprofits.
No.
But I do believe, and let's see, Leanne, would you agree that most nonprofits really kind of feel like they're challenged differently, but they're not?
Oh yes, that's there's a lot of commonality in terms of what we face day to day and how we think it's unique to us. But when you really, Venn diagram is my favorite thing in the world, right? Whenever we're having conversations, but when you really Venn diagram what an organization's pain points are, where they're coming from, there is a lot of crossover. If your mission is in the environment, if your mission is in, human rights, civil rights, activism, what those pieces are, there is a lot of commonalities in terms of what we struggle to reach those goals and those missions and objectives. So it's also the same when we talk about for-profits, when we talk about those pieces. So sometimes we just claim we're all so different, but we're just using a different language to talk about the same hurdles. And strengths is a really great way to create a common language to approach those hurdles or those barriers in our work, and have different conversations. So it is about addressing the pain point in how the organization identifies it. However, as coaches, we don't go in and say, oh, we're all the same, like everybody deals with the same thing.
No, right.
But identifying that pain point of what the organization's element is, and starting that conversation there is a great way to have that first conversation about strengths funds. And I kind of bring that up because I see Chad's question in the chat box about how do we have those conversations with organizations with large points. So I kind of tied those two, Alan and Chad's conversations together.
Great. Thank you so much for being here, Leanne. Let's have some last words here because we're about running out of time. I hope you have found value in this call for your nonprofit leadership. We have coaches ready to help you and who are very experienced in the area. Carol, last words from you, ma'am. You're
I'd like to tie into something that John said earlier. And it's really important that we not, as nonprofits, get tied up with having everything go into direct costs, and that we realize that having 99% of your funds spent for direct services is not the best way to manage your people and actually to provide services. And strengths-based management for your entire team is really critical, and it's worth the percentages that you spend on it.
Yeah, I bet. So, John, I know that's important to you. So, last words, sir.
Well, Carol took my great words there. I love those. I would agree. I would also say, I think, again, depending on where an organization is at in its life cycle, to me, is one that I think comes up a lot, to recognize that, a startup phase, there are certain strengths needed. As an organization matures, there's different strengths needed, and in different roles, and the board's going to look different. So to me, it's not okay. We figured out our strengths 5 years ago with the people who were here. It's really about who's here now, and as potentially the vision changes, likely the vision changes, who do we really need on the team right now?
Yes, absolutely. Love that. Thank you so much for being here, John. Let's see. Amy Allen, I want to unmute you. Last words, please, ma'am, about executive directors that you work with and things that you want them to know.
I love what Carol and John said. From the boards that I've worked with, I think it's so important to allow the boards to look at their strengths and each other's strengths, so that once you can do that, they can take that strategic plan and they can put themselves into the plan and figure out how they can be successful together. I love what John talked about, where an organization is at in their planning process, because again, it really does make a difference on whether you are at the startup or later on. I would just encourage everyone to look at the strengths of their boards and utilize the people who are so passionate about your organization, because they're there because they love you.
Yeah, absolutely. They do love the mission. Alan, last words here, ma'am, if you'll unmute and come share, because that's true, right?
Yes, definitely. One thing that was talked about was the exit interviews, and what I always learned from one of Gallup's books, First Break All the Rules, great leadership book, is on stay interviews. Interviewing your employees, why are they staying with the organization? Talk with your board members, why are they staying as a part of the board? So keep that as a part of your process as well.
Wow, I love that, Alan. Thank you so much. Leanne, we will finish up with you, ma'am. Last words.
Great. Yeah, I think I love everyone's points. I will echo them, reflect them all back in their greatness. I think in addition to that, I'll add that, when we look at strengths from a board lens, and when you look at it all the way down the organization, what it can do for your advisory boards, for your volunteers, for your actual strategic planning, for that all of those pain points that nonprofits have, staff engagement, all of those elements, staff turnover, it really does help start to uncover that onion, if you will, in terms of what does organizations need. We spent a lot of time talking about the boards today, and we could just talk for hours in terms of where is the return on the investment in strengths, but investing in that approach and finding people to come in and counsel you like a coach does at the sideline of a field versus someone who comes at you every year and says, this is what you need to do, what you did back in February, and it's October, and you're thinking, what did I do in February? So having that real life, that opportunity to engage at that piece can benefit the organization from the board all the way through to the program level and the frontline staff. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. I so appreciate y'all sharing your experience so that we can help nonprofits be more, have more, and do more, make a greater impact. I know that's where you all are. And thank you all for joining us. And I'm going to send out this replay, and I will link you to each of the coaches that have been on this panel today. And if you're looking for coaching in any other area of your life, whether that's your education, maybe your work team, or maybe faith and family areas, SOAR.com has amazing coaches ready to serve you. I'm Rhonda Boyle, the community leader of the SOAR online platform, and I'm so glad that you could join us today. Thanks, everybody. We'll see ya. Bye-bye.